I want thank you, Sam, for that reading, and I want to thank Jamil for a beautiful poem and allowing us to read it today. Today, my topic is lifting the stigma of extraterrestrials, and it is a topic that we've never spoken about before in the Sunday Circle, so it's completely new ground. I'm stretching into it. And I think it would be just a beautiful thing simply to be able to talk about it in a safe space. And our community is already an accomplishment, like that poem was mentioning. So I'm going to launch into it, and I'm going to I decided at first I was thinking of getting into it through some passages from the Bible that people have kind of correlated angelic arrivals with UFO sightings and so forth. But actually, that was too much for me to handle for this talk. So I instead turned to Daoist philosopher Zhuangzi and this parable of the frog in the dilapidated well. And I'm going to use that to ground my reflections today. And in this dialogue, Zhuangzi has a dialogue a lot like the Socratic dialogues of Plato. And one of the students is saying, I don't know what to think now that I'm talking with Zhuangzi. I'm completely flabbergasted. And then someone in the conversation brings up this parable. Have you not heard of the frog of the dilapidated well, and how it said to the turtle of the eastern sea, how I enjoy myself? I leap upon the parapet of this wall. I enter, and having by means of the projections formed by the fragments of the broken tiles of the lining proceeded to the water, I draw my legs together, keep my chin up, and strike out. When I have got to the mud, I dive till my feet are lost in it. Then turning round, I see that of the shrimps, crabs, and tadpoles. There is not one that can do like me. Moreover, when one has entire command of all the water in the gully and hesitates to go forward, it is the greatest pleasure to enjoy oneself here in this dilapidated well. Why do not you, master, often come and enter and see it for yourself? The turtle of the eastern sea was then proceeding to go forward, but before he had put in his left foot, he found his right knee caught and held fast. On this, he hesitated, drew back, and told the frog all about the sea, saying, a distance of 1,000 li is not sufficient to express its extent, nor would a line of 8,000 cubits be equal to sound its depth. In the time of you, for 9 years out of 10, the flooded land all drained into it, and its water was not sensibly increased. And at the time of Thang, for 7 years out of 8, there was a drought, but the rocks on the shore saw no diminution of the water because of it. Thus it is that no change is produced in its waters by any cause operating for a short time or a long, and that they do not advance nor recede for any addition or subtraction, whether great or small. And this is the great pleasure afforded by the eastern sea. When the frog of the dilapidated well heard this, he was amazed and terror-struck and lost himself in surprise. And from my vantage point, within my own dilapidated well experience, now taking a look today at this phenomenon of extraterrestrials, what used to sometimes be called UFOs. Now in the new report, they're called UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. And like I said, it's a very tricky topic. And even as I was preparing to speak on it today, in the last week or so, I really felt the weight of the stigma on this topic. It's quite heavy. And rarely when I post a sermon topic on social media do I get the kind of derision that I received for this topic, which tells you something. And I want to start by taking a look, just to ground this conversation more, at the recent UFO or UAP report. Has anybody seen this? Okay, so Sally, a couple of people have seen it. So just to give you a sense of what it is, I'll share my screen. And you could see there's this unclassified report, which was handed to Congress just a couple weeks ago, June 25th. And it was about unidentified aerial phenomenon and what is really going on. One of the highlights of the report, I read it pretty carefully. It's not easy reading. One of the highlights is that they're having trouble because of the disparagement. People who, whether they're aviators or whether they're analysts from the military or the intelligence community, they don't want to talk about it or report about it or discuss it because they're being disparaged. And there's, reputational risk that is lessening, but that is still really an issue. So the report, they want to start getting more information and reduce the stigma and start really studying what's going on. I'll show you one other part that really caught my attention. Let's see. I can't find it. 1 second. This part, yes, that a handful of the UAP appear to demonstrate advanced technology and that they appear to remain stationary in winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. And sometimes they have radio frequencies and so forth. And they've picked them up with multiple sensors, and all of this other information is contained in this fascinating report, which sparked a lot of conversation and blog posts and dinner tables and philosophical forums such as Donna is hosting on the Thursday nights. And so I figured that I would bring this topic up and open a conversation on it. But for me, just to be a little more personal now, the way I got into this topic is many years ago when I was a grad student, maybe 2012, 2011, something around that time. My advisor, who was the chair of the ethics department at the School of Theology at BU, called me into his office for a meeting or a conversation with no real topic, and shared with me that he was, he had recently, I think, received tenure, and he was now working on extraterrestrials. And that was going to be his research. Now I was a student in social ethics, environmental ethics with him. And honestly, I was just shocked. I was embarrassed. I was like, oh no, my advisor's like studying this taboo topic that is not what I signed up for when I took him as my advisor. Because it was something I hadn't considered. And I was a little bit like, the frog in the dilapidated well who's like, what are you talking about? So my advisor, John Hart, had been doing this research, throughout his life. And it was inspired by, his own experience. Because when he was in college, he was out with his friends and they saw some UFO appear in the sky. And then later, he read op-eds by other people in the area who had also seen them. And so he had a firsthand experience and he was interested in the topic. And he described to me, that it was a real struggle. And this is in his book as well, because there's so much stigma in academia that if you try to write on this topic, you could lose your position. You could lose your funding. You will be teased. And there will be macroaggressions and the microaggressions. And it's just very hard to get space to think about this in a serious way and write about it, which is also noted in that report to Congress. So I think this talk is definitely in the spirit of lifting some of this stigma and giving some space for this topic. When at the time, I was like very shocked, and my advisor, I think, was trying to comfort me. So he was like, well, you know, there is a link to the Bible. Because I was so biblical in my thinking at that time. He's like, you know, there is a link. He's like, I was talking with Elie Wiesel, who's obviously a fantastic scholar, and who's also a BU professor. And he's like, John, the closest thing we have to aliens in the Bible and in the Jewish tradition is really angels. And so, you know, I was like, I think that helped me. And with some other rationalizations at the time, I kind of settled in with the information in a comfortable way. Today, I was thinking of going down that path. And I spent a lot of time with the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, which I'm happy to look at with you all sometime, but that is too much for this talk. It would take a long time, but it is fascinating. And there are a lot of questions about what this chariot that Ezekiel sees really is and where it comes from. But I want to move in a different direction. I really want to focus on some of the substance of one of the books that my advisor wrote on the subject called Cosmic Comets, and some of the stories within that that he recounts. And again, we could another time go into the topic of the interesting overlap between kind of language used for God and angels and UFOs. There is overlap, and that for many people is scary to know that there's this kind of overlap there. But I think it's exciting. And we know we have limits. We know that we aren't able to know everything that's going on, and I'm not pretending to know what's happening with this. A lot more research is needed, and a lot of other people know more than I do. But I do want to look at some of these big issues that have come up when you look not just at this bare information from the official report, but at some of the more qualitative things that people say to say, I have experienced this, this is my story, which, you know, scholars have sorted through and tried to figure out which stories seem more credible that they want to go with and look at more closely. And what comes up are some of these core ethical issues. For example, that was as raised in the poem we heard, how do we regard extraterrestrials? Do we see them as alien others with fear and see them as enemies and adversaries? Or are we seeing them as related to us, possibly benevolent and so forth? So my advisor was very interested in this and took a very kind of idealistic view and wanted to talk about stories where people have very benevolent descriptions of extraterrestrials. So, for example, he talks about stories where, and a lot of these are described by, you know, former military personnel, pretty much all of them, where, for example, people have fired at the UFOs with, he talks about rockets or cannons. And they are described as absorbing the projectiles into themselves without apparent damage or leaving the scene at very high speeds. He talks about, he goes more into depth in a couple of stories where a couple in the US and once in the USSR, where the ETI, the UFOs, come to nuclear weapons facilities and they shut down the facilities and then they leave. And he also mentions an unconfirmed report from Big Sur in California where there was a AP that came and a dummy missile was being launched, as it were a nuclear launch, and the UFO comes and destroys it with a laser. So these are some of the stories that come up. Of UFOs kind of making contact with people, perhaps having this special interest in our most dangerous activities like nuclear weapons. And he looked really closely at this one retired Air Force captain, Robert Salas, who describes his whole experience where he was at a control center in Montana where they had 10 nuclear missiles kind of ready. These bases exist around the US. They're strategically located to launch missiles around the world if needed to obliterate major cities around the world. A UFO visited. He claimed that the UFO was there, communicated with him and others telepathically, sent a message of peace and understanding, and then symbolically shut down all of the missiles one by one without destroying anything, just depowered them all and then left. And they were left to kind of make sense of that. And I wanted to share this quote from Robert Salas. He says, "Clearly, they have announced their presence to all humanity. I think the main message is that we humans seem to be bent on our own destruction by the way we are treating ourselves and our home planet. Nuclear energy and weapons is just one aspect of this, and because of my experience, that has been my main message whenever I speak or write. Further, we can only resolve these questions of the environment and our proclivity to be warlike through cooperative actions. I think ET wants to see some results in this direction before making full contact." So that's just a little taste of some of what people are talking about. And when I read the UAP report, it's interesting because they say most of these sightings are around military operations and they're often disrupting them, for example. So that's why the Navy pilots are talking about it, because they have to shut down their test mission because they've almost hit a UAP or there's UAP around, so it's not safe. So these are very interesting perspectives. And one thing that I began to think about is how there's almost kind of layers of taboo or layers of stigma around these topics, where nuclear weapons just by themselves is a taboo subject, because kind of like extraterrestrials, it overwhelms our everyday consciousness. If we were to actually think about the reality of our country being armed and prepared to destroy all these other countries at any moment, and they're in the same position, Russia and China and other countries, just ready to completely obliterate almost all life on Earth, it would be kind of destabilizing to our, tender, our tender egos and our minds and our everyday life. It would be harder to just go about our consumer ways and just kind of be peaceful and calm. And that was even more of a problem during the Cold War. But it's still not a resolved issue. And I remember hearing just a quick little snippet on the radio, I think a few years ago. It's just a matter of fact, by the way, government thinks we need to spend $1 trillion to update the nuclear arsenal over the next several years. It's is that a 10-second soundbite on NPR, or is that a very controversial topic? Are we really going to be investing $1 trillion to just in case we need to destroy all life? Just in case. because we have to be able to destroy all life because they're able to destroy all life. And, you know, how else could we negotiate our differences except with that kind of ultimate leverage? I almost think it would be like if your family members, everyone in the household is armed to the teeth, or everyone's strapped with a suicide vest in case, you know, the conversation about who cleans up after dinner just goes wrong. So you're ready, you know, you're ready to just let loose if that occurs, which is basically where we're at with the nuclear weapons thing. So it's so absurd and so crazy you can't talk about it. Climate change is very similar as well, because it's such a big problem that we're hiding from it. We're like kids hiding behind the door. We don't want to face it. And so when the UFO conversation comes up, those topics come up as well. And the people who are claiming to have sightings and to have experienced it are bringing up topics. It's like a taboo within a taboo. But when I think about it, when I'm reflecting on it, I think, well, if a more advanced species with a bigger perspective did come to look at us and talk to us, they would not be avoiding these topics. They would be talking to us about our warlike nature and the risk of nuclear weapons and that we're destroying our planet. I don't think they would want to talk to us about so many other things because those seem like pretty big issues. Same thing if I think if God was going to send an angel out of the sky or going to, you know, entrust somebody with a fresh revelation in book form, or, you know, I think those subjects would come up too. I don't think God would skip a beat to not mention, you got nuclear weapons. What are you going to do? You have climate change. You have to fix these. So these, I think, are some of the issues of our time. And I appreciate the way the kind of reflection on extraterrestrials and the experiences that people are talking about are identifying these key ethical issues. And they're raising these other questions also about, like, how do we regard others? How would we regard extraterrestrials? Are they our enemies? Or are they, like the poet was saying, they're our family. We're all one. We're all part. And that narrative too ties back to these other narratives in our nation where it's like anything foreign is an adversary. Immigrants from other countries are you know, could harm us. Russia, China, all this fear thinking that's got us building nuclear weapons and not dealing with the real task, which is to preserve our planet and to cultivate a society that is safe, that is loving, and that is humane. So I'm inspired by this conversation. I think it's a pathway out of everyday consciousness. It's a way for us to see a bigger picture, just like that frog in the dilapidated well. I love that metaphor. I can see myself being a proud human being. We love being in control of everything. We have such a small experience, but we're so like excited about our competencies. And then, you know, I also appreciate the fact that our world, even as we look beyond it, yet we are still within the well. We can't go into the sea as these vulnerable frogs, but we could maybe be repairing the well. We could maybe get a fresh perspective. We could understand kind of how to bring our worlds more into accord with kind of that greater piece of the universe itself. So I want to thank you for indulging in this and opening your minds and thinking about a subject that I think can be overwhelming, but at the same time could be liberating. And I know that I've spoken to so many people about this. I know there's such a range of beliefs on this topic, and there's a range of information and knowledge. And I just want to honor where everyone's at. And I would like to open up the conversation to the wisdom of the community.